McGrath 1970 came up with the stress process. A demand will be required and will be needed if a positive perception is taken, and it is seen as a challenge. The person will experience eustress and an increased performance. However, athletes like Nick will perceive this demand as a negative threat and experience distress and increased worry, therefore reducing his performance. In a second scenario, we see Sarah and Rachel, who play netball for the school. Unlike Nick, Sarah is experiencing a different form of anxiety. She is not regularly anxious, and it is not part of her everyday life. Therefore, it is not part of her traits. Instead, Sarah experiences state anxiety. State anxiety refers to right now feelings that change from moment to moment. A temporary, ever-changing mood state that is an emotional response to any situation considered to be threatening. State anxiety can be cognitive or somatic. We know that Sarah is experiencing state anxiety because in her training sessions and local games, she seems to be calm and is able to score. However, when playing league games against Lewis and Vandine, her scoring average decreases and she struggles to control her nerves. This is most likely cognitive anxiety, because she will be thinking about how well she needs to perform and play against big league games. Big league games will be scary to her. Due to her being nervous about playing these games, she will experience physical components of anxiety, such as muscle tension, shortness of breath, and clammy hands, which will lead to somatic anxiety. Sarah will also be experiencing competitive anxiety. This is where the performer specifically perceives competitive sporting situations as potentially threatening. Competitive state anxiety usually follows patterns of subjective feelings of tension and inadequacy, combined with heightened arousal of the ANS. Hackford and Schweinmeister, 1987. Both elite and average sports performers experience intense anxiety before and during performance. Due to Sarah only competing at a school level, she won't have been taught to control this anxiety, whereas elite performers are trained to control their anxiety and stress at crucial times. To combat this competitive anxiety, professional athletes such as Jonny Wilkinson choose to train at a higher intensity than they play. For example, he practices by taking shots at far ranges and making them so difficult so that when he takes a shot during an actual game, he knows he can make it with less pressure. The brain can then complete easier tasks without thinking too hard about them. If he practices hard shots, then the easy stuff will become natural to him, and his brain will revert back to it. Seeing as Sarah is a goal shooter, this will be beneficial to her. If she practiced by taking shots around the D and being harshly marked by an opponent she is comfortable with, then in these situations that happen against big league games, the pressure will be lifted even though the difficulty level is still present. This would mean when it came to playing trickier competitive games and she was under this intense pressure from the crowd and her peers, she should be able to score naturally rather than just a fluke, and her percentage of shots will increase. For example, it is very common to see misses of goals at high-intensity games. For example, when England played Portugal in the quarter-final of the World Cup, the win was down to penalties. This is immense pressure for the players involved and caused the players of England to buckle and lose the game. Their ability to control their anxiety wasn't as good as that from the Portuguese team. It proves that sports psychology is often a very important part of successful athletes. There are several factors that affect competitive anxiety pre-competition and during the competition. Pre-competition, Sarah will have a fear of failure, mistakes, and bad performance. It is a fear of how important the event is, a fear of evaluation, and even a fear of injury that will prevent Sarah from playing her best. If she is playing an away match at somewhere like Lewis or Vandine, then she will also have a lack of control, as she is playing somewhere unfamiliar to her, and potentially with an unfamiliar biased referee. This will all contribute to anxieties pre-game. During the competition itself, she will experience other fears, like being evaluated by others, like the crowd and the opposition, and this will make her nervous. She will also have to interact with others, deal with potential injuries and fatigue, and then there will be the influence of environmental factors, like the weather if she's playing outside. Her success or failure may also be based on the time she has left during the game, which will up anxieties. If her team are drawed and they're near the end of a game, then pressure will be placed immensely on her to try and score and win the game. In the graph on the slide, it shows research from the Competitive State Anxiety Inventory 2, Martins 1990. It uses a self-report to measure cognitive state anxiety, and self-confidence. It will be given out several times prior to competition to discover baseline levels and compare with pre-competition levels. Cognitive state anxiety can be high a long time before competition, so it is shown in the top line. It is a steady increase before competition and will fluctuate during performance, depending on success and failure changes. It will immediately lower during play as the player will relax into the game. Somatic anxiety, shown on the bottom line, is lower to begin with as the body won't react so soon. However, it will increase quickly before competition as a player becomes nervous. It generally decreases during a competition as a player becomes comfortable. Patterns have indicated that cognitive anxiety increases leading up to competition, remains high, and does not increase just prior to the start of competition. Patterns have indicated that cognitive anxiety increases leading up to competition, remains high, and does a slight increase just prior to the start of competition. It can fluctuate during a competition in relation to success or failure. Somatic anxiety remains low until a dramatic rise a few hours before the event. It then decreases during the competition. Sarah will experience different levels of arousal depending on how well the play is going for her. One explanation for this is drive theory, Hull 1951. He proposed that one of the earliest and most simplistic explanations of arousal. It proposes a linear relationship between arousal and performance, showing that as arousal increases, so does levels of performance. Zhejiang 1965 developed Hull's theory and suggested that the presence of others increases arousal, which brings out the dominant response, which is likely to be the way the performer is going to perform their skill or task. He believed that increased arousal or drive will elicit the dominant response. Sarah does not fit into this drive theory evaluation, as when her arousal becomes too high, her performance levels begin to decrease. If it matched this theory, then as her arousal levels began to increase, she would continue making shots, and actually her level of precision would increase. However, other players like Rachel would match this of the drive theory. This is because she thrives off of the atmosphere and challenging situations. Positives of the drive theory are that it is true for experienced performers and for those with well-learned skills, where the dominant response is the correct one. It is true for simple gross motor skills. If Rachel is playing in a defending position, then she may find that having more arousal will help her defend her player from the ball, whereas when Sarah needs to shoot, she needs less arousal and more concentration. Criticisms of drive theory are that it doesn't match all experienced performers. It assumes low arousal means poorer performance, and it doesn't match novice performances where their dominant response is incorrect. It also does not correctly differentiate between anxiety and arousal. Rachel will have learned to cope with her arousal, and being cheered on by the crowd will only spur her to do better. As previously mentioned, athletes like Greg Rutherford do not follow this drive theory, as when he becomes over-aroused, he misses his jumps. Many tennis players will also learn different serves. If one tennis player becomes comfortable with a serve, then they will use this when they are stressed or not stressed, as this is what their brain reverts back to. If in practice they attempt to learn a new stroke, then when they are stressed during high-level games, their brains will not register and remember how to use the stroke correctly, and they will just revert back to the original stroke they learned. This also opposes the theory of drive theory, as their arousals are getting higher but their performance levels are getting lower. A different arousal theory may explain Serrel's level of arousal more accurately is that of the inverted U theory. This inverted U theory shows that as arousal increases, so does performance, and up to an optimal point, further increases in arousal after this causes performances to gradually decline. The graph performance relationship is described as curvilinear. The optimal levels of arousal can change or differ depending on the type of task, task complexity, or decision making, the performer's skill level, and the performer's personality. Sarah specifically fits into this theory of inverted U because she has an optimal level of arousal where she will be able to score correctly. This is usually within her practice or local games where her scoring average is much higher. During league games against Lewes or Vardine, her arousal levels become too high and therefore her performance decreases. Her performance is affected in the same way as if she didn't have enough arousal to begin with. The positives of the inverted U theory is that there is an acceptance of worsened performance if under or over aroused. There are many criticisms, however. Such as optimal arousal is always at the midpoint of the curve, as demonstrated on the graph. One curve does not also explain the different optimal arousals needed for simple and complex tasks. It also shows that the decline in performance is always gradual, but we know that this isn't always the case. The catastrophe theory would take place if there was a sudden drop in performance level. This may happen if Sarah started to constantly miss the net, and therefore her performance level would drop off completely. Another arousal model is that of individual loans of optimal functioning. Hanin, 1986. He determined that different types of athletes had different optimal levels of arousal, and that the optimal level was not always at a midpoint on a continuum. Athlete A would perform best at a lower level of arousal. Athlete B performed best at an intermediate zone of arousal, and athlete C performed best at high levels of arousal. The explanation of the IZOF characteristics are that athletes have individual differences and preferences for a level of anxiety that is optimal for them individually. The athlete must feel in control, have effortless performance, be performing at optimal levels of arousal. Execution of skills must bring fun and enjoyment. Attention and concentration is focused and feeling completely confident. Hanin's research proposed that there are individual differences in the way people respond to anxiety. He found that some elite athletes succeeded when anxiety was low, while others achieved when anxiety was high. He concluded that each athlete has their own optimal level of anxiety, which can produce their best performance. Optimal levels of anxiety is not a point or a threshold, which is suggested by the inverted U or catastrophe theory, but it is a bandwidth. In relation with this band, the athletes are neither psyching up to, nor are they exceeding a threshold of arousal at any point in time. He believed they were simply either within or outside of the zone of anxiety that is individual to them. We can conclude from this that Rachel's IZOF would be much higher than that of Sarah's. Even though both of their zones are different, they both have their own optimal ranges. If Sarah becomes overly aroused, she won't perform well, whereas if Rachel is under-aroused, she won't perform well. Typically, those with a low zone of functioning like Sarah's are introverts and are performing simple gross motor skills. They are usually in the cognitive associative phase of learning and are novice performers. Those with high zones of functioning like Rachel are typically extroverts, completing complex fine skills. They're usually within the autonomous phase of learning and are experienced performers. Obviously, this can differ and isn't always true. Research generally supports this theory and is found to be a better predictor of arousal and success than the inverted U theory. However, there is no explanation of how it develops, and while our best performance is more likely in the optimal zone, it is also based on situational and personal factors and can't be predicted based on an athlete's experience, or just on an athlete's experience. Athletes like Tiger Woods will have a much lower individual zone than an athlete like Owen Farrell, due to the different natures of their sports. It wouldn't be fair to compare them to one another, as you wouldn't regularly compare a golfer and a rugby player.